Well, good morning, everyone. So as Andrani has already said, welcome to Landscapes of Border Control and Immigration Detention in Europe. My name's Dominic Aitken. Welcome to my lair. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Bath in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences. So this panel, the first panel of the conference, is on researching detention and displacement. This panel will last 2 hours. That means it ends at 11 AM British summertime, where I am, or whatever time that is where you are. We have 4 speakers in today's panel. The way that it will work is I will briefly introduce each speaker prior to them giving a 15-minute presentation. Today, we are joined by Professor Mary Bosworth from the University of Oxford and Monash University, Dr. Evgenia Iliadou from the University of Surrey, Dr. Martina Tazzioli from Goldsmith University of London, and finally, Dr. Sana Murrani from the University of Plymouth. So as I say, I'll give each speaker a fuller introduction prior to them speaking. They will present for 15 minutes, and then the Q&A will be at the end of the session as a whole. Audience, please feel free to type questions into the chat box as the speakers go. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, then it would be helpful if you name them, although it may be fairly obvious who it is you'd like to ask it to. So you can type questions in the chat box as you go, but also at the end of the session, we'll have a good amount of time for questions and answers. So feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A session and we can invite you to ask your question. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Mary Bosworth from the University of Oxford and Monash University. Mary is a professor of criminology and fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford, where she directs the Centre for Criminology and Border Criminologies. She is also concurrently Professor of Criminology at Monash University in Australia. Mary has published very widely on issues to do with immigration detention, and with a particular focus on the UK, but also together with Andrew Anafili and Hendpal Bui on Greece. She's currently conducting research on the escorting and transportation of detainees in the UK. She has also done a great deal of other publishing and research work in many different areas, and has also guided many a fledgling PhD student to the completion of their studies, for which I am certainly eternally grateful. So without any further ado, Professor Mary Bosworth.
Thanks, Dominic. Thank you for that introduction. And I'd like to, first of all, congratulate Andriani and Francesca for all their work in pulling together this exciting conference. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot over the next few days. I'm going to share my screen, and so please tell me if it doesn't work. Okay, that looks like it's working on my end. So today I'm talking about work in progress. And I have presented a version of this paper before in an online conference in Canada in November. So I apologize if you've already seen that version. I'm trying to revise the paper, so I really welcome any questions and comments that people have. The paper on which the talk is based is drawn from written responses on 277 surveys that I administered along with Alice Gerlach and a small research team that included Francesca across all of the immigration removal centres in the United Kingdom from July to September 2019, so before the pandemic. And I have to say, I haven't been back into detention since the pandemic. So I mean, again, we may want to be, and I know we will be later on in the week talking about the effects of the pandemic. The paper was inspired in part by 2 interconnected questions. What can we learn from conducting research inside detention centres that we don't already know? And what can we do with the information we gather from empirical research? I'm guided in some of my thinking by academic studies of the prison, where scholars quite confidently state that learning about what prison is like informs understanding about what prison is for. In the bulk of that field, at least in the United Kingdom, academic discussions of the prison turn on issues of justice and legitimacy. The implication being that prisons operate with a deficit of both, but with sufficient and thorough research, those problems can be remedied. As I've written about elsewhere, I don't think that that argument applies to detention centres, not only if you're an abolitionist, but also because quite fundamentally, immigration detention centres break with key liberal values and norms. Those detained within them are not considered to be equal members of a shared community of value by the state. Rather, their incarceration in detention centres marks them out symbolically and also quite practically as outsiders to those ideas. And yet at the same time, at least in Britain, detention centres are not beyond the law. They're not in a state of exception. And even though we know of examples of staff brutality, for the most part, the kinds of distress that people describe spring from quite banal issues, many of which are either based beyond the detention centres themselves or are simply inherent to the immigration control system. People are particularly distressed by the uncertainty of the duration and outcome of their detention. They find it hard to access lawyers or to get any answers about their immigration case. Because the decision to detain is made by people they never meet and can be enforced without warning, for instance, while they're regularly reporting as part of their asylum process, it feels and indeed is arbitrary and unfair. Everyone knows someone in a similar position to themselves who is not being detained. Once detained, such matters are made worse by the limited range of activities available in detention centres and by inadequate mental and physical health care and access to legal advice. I'm sure all of this sounds familiar, and indeed it's the familiarity of these kinds of issues that leads me back to the two questions. What can we learn from conducting research inside immigration detention centres that we don't already know? And what can we do with the information we gather from our research? My fear is that emphasising pain and suffering has had little effect on the government's enthusiasm for locking up migrants, since even though there's plenty of evidence about the negative effect of detention, and despite the fact that there are considerably cheaper alternatives, most states everywhere remain committed to this form of custody. Also, and relatedly, I think focusing only on the internal aspects of detention centres risks overlooking how many of the issues that people in detention raise are actually caused by factors far beyond them. So rather than taking a sociological approach to life in detention, I suggest that the pain people describe illuminates the need for a new politics of detention. Thinking about pain politically, I think, refreshes some of the academic literature while avoiding the dangers of extractive, or what some people call pornographic, study in which people in detention appear as abject victims. Grounding it empirically also ensures that the voices of people who are detained guide our conceptual work and our discussions. So that's the broad argument that I'm presenting today. And what I'm going to do in the remaining time is just to tell you a little bit more about immigration detention in the UK, for those of you who are not here, and the empirical research that underpins the paper, before sharing with you some of the things that people wrote onto the surveys and drawing some conclusions. Immigration removal centres in the United Kingdom are wholly contracted out, meaning that all institutions are run either by private security firms or the prison service on behalf of the Home Office. Numbers detained in Britain have been on a steady decline for some time and have dropped precipitously during the pandemic to less than 1,000 people. Since 2014, the number of establishments has halved from 14 to 7. The kinds of people who are detained has also changed. Before the pandemic, IRCs held people for an array of different kinds of immigration issues, but since the pandemic and during the pandemic, they really now just hold two main populations: people who have been convicted of a criminal offence and served a prison sentence, or asylum seekers who have arrived recently on small boats across from northern France. Although immigration detainees are not serving a criminal sentence, those who come from prison may not fully appreciate the distinction between the institutions. Both are built securely, both have razor wire, and in both they'll be placed in a shared cell, and they'll be managed, helped, controlled and restrained by officers in uniform who carry keys. Given these structural overlaps, it's not surprising that criminologists have turned to the pains of imprisonment framework to understand everyday life in these places. In addition to Gresham Sykes's original 5 deprivations, scholars have identified additional matters like exploitation, coercion, and legal violence, as well as the significant temporal uncertainty that people in detention often face. And indeed, many of those who wrote comments on the survey complained about similar kinds of things. So they complained about healthcare provision, in particular the lack of mental health care support. Women and men were also unhappy about the food. They regularly referred to it as inedible, sometimes spoiled or uncooked. Sometimes there just wasn't enough of it, they were hungry. Across all the centres, people raised concerns about poor hygiene and lack of cleanliness. In Harmondsworth, they complained about bed bugs, in Colnbrook about mice, and in Morton Hall about rats. Everywhere, people criticised the lack of fresh air and access to outdoor spaces, insufficient activities and paid work, and the difficulties they faced in communicating with staff in the centres and with the immigration caseworkers outside the centres. In this lengthy quote from Abdul, you see how some of these matters come together. So he says, he's written here, I'm an asthma attack patient. I have breathing difficulties, anxiety, agitation, memory loss, depression, suicidal thoughts, loss of appetite. I can't eat the food here. Sometimes they serve rotten bread. I can't leave the environment. I need more care and medication, which I can get from my community people. And Adi, in a different centre, says much the same thing, rather more succinctly. Everything is shit in here, no lie, no communication, everything's on permanent hold, no fan in the cells, and summertime is really hard. We find it difficult to breathe. The food is of low quality, the beds are not comfortable, the winds stink, detainee workers are not paid good money. Many of these aspects of daily life in detention relate to the good order and running of the centre, and so could, and indeed should, be addressed by the private contractors. In addition to them, detainees also raise a series of external causes of distress, and many of these relate to their prior experiences of trauma and victimisation, often at the hands of state agents, i.e. they talk about torture. They also complain about the difficulties they face in getting legal advice, in understanding the decision-making of the courts, and the relationship between the detention custody officers and border control. Again, here we have a long quote from a man called Bahadur, which draws many of these issues together, showing how for somebody who's in detention, they all connect. I've been a victim of torture, he writes, in my country, Uzbekistan. I've trouble sleeping at night, suffering from PTSD, and I'm not receiving the correct help for me to be able to deal with the nightmares I'm suffering from. Detention is taking a toll on my private life. My solicitor is not helping. Most of the time, she doesn't pick up my calls. My friend helped me to fill in the bail application, but the judge refused me bail. I don't understand because I don't have a passport or any type of documentation. For Orhan, matters are even less comprehensible because he actually wants to return. I've been captive here for the last 5 days and I want to go back to Turkey, he writes. In Yar's Wood, we see from a quote from a woman who I've called Ijo, how the external factors shape her experience of incarceration and her experience of the institution as a whole. Here she writes that Yar's Wood is an entirely different world where you go through things you've never wanted to wish for yourself. Yar's Wood Removal Centre and the entire Home Office and the courts do not give us a fair trial. None of our cases are being considered. Seems like everything we tell them is used against us. Dom, are you coming back on because I'm running out of time?
Yeah, so you've got 3.5 minutes. I give you the warning. Yeah.
Okay. Also in Yar's Wood, another woman says something very similar, but here she tries to explain how all of this uncertainty shapes her experience of the physical layout of the detention centre itself, and how the legal corridor in particular is a frightening place for her. So basically, what I'm sort of thinking about here is why are these quotes important, and why am I reluctant to think about them in terms of prison sociology? Well, basically, I think we can learn more by thinking about them in terms of political theory and criminologists working on citizenship and membership. Because we need to remember that detention centres are above all sites in which people are excluded. They're places, in other words, they're the concrete form, rather, of what Chantal Mouffe refers to as the moment of closure in a liberal democracy. They're the evidence that we can't all be members, no matter how much we might wish to be. If we consider people's testimonies in political terms, then we start to see how what they're discussing is not just personal suffering, but political claims with much wider ramifications. So for the women in Yarlswood, the difficulty that they were describing is the lack of access to due process protections and the rule of law. For Orhan, the British state becomes a kidnapper. And then in this other quote here from a young man in Tinsley House, the state is actually culpable or potentially culpable in his death. Finally, in Colnbrook, one last testimony drives the point home, where this man has written, "You can see and experience everything here except human rights and law, where slaves and immigration is acting like our Lord." By tying together all these elements, human rights, slavery, and privatization, this man is not simply relaying individual pains caused by a loss of liberty, but he's rather illuminating how these sites rely on and generate structural inequalities that are anathema to liberalism and democracy. They're more than pains, in other words, they're the political system. So to conclude, it's clear that a period of detention is painful, yet claims about the suffering of those behind bars have had little effect on the justification of these places. The public and politicians remain either broadly indifferent to those within or perfectly happy for them to suffer at least a little. So what can we do, and what's the role of research? Well, to start with, I think these quotes show vividly the lived experience of the kind of abnormal justice that border criminologists have revealed is a key effect of the growing intersections between immigration control and criminal justice, which rests on and articulates membership. Those who are cast out by the threat of or actual border control have far less capacity for redress than citizens. If we view the cause and site of this form of abnormal justice in political terms as a choice that states make, and therefore as a choice that affects all of us, not just those who are locked up, then the kinds of testimonies that I've shared today, which are familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, demand redress not just because people are suffering, but because their suffering undermines the values and institutions that we ourselves believe in. For the world in which they describe, in which people are kidnapped and made slaves, in which family ties are sundered and human rights denied, undermine the basic tenets of liberalism as well as of democracy. Their words offer us an important opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to minimizing cruelty. In order to do that, we must accept and acknowledge that our current political order has failed to deliver on its promise. It need not be an inescapable result of the moment of closure of liberal democracies, and therefore we can do more than argue that detention falls short of some universal ideal that we value. Rather, we can learn from the pain the people recorded here to use it as a form for the basis for keeping the boundaries of our democracy and our value systems open. For that to happen, however, in the words of Clara on this final slide, who'd lived in Britain for 9 years before being placed in Yarlswood, there's only one way forward. This centre needs to be closed down as soon as possible because immigrants are treated like animals. We're human beings, for God's sake. Thank you, and sorry, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Professor Mary Bosworth. That was very good timing. Thank you very much, Mary. That was a fantastic introduction to today's conference and to this first panel. Audience members, just to remind you, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box as we go, but there will also be time at the end for you to ask your questions by using the raise hand function on Zoom. So our next speaker is Dr. Evgenia Iliadou. Evgenia joined the University of Surrey in August 2020 as a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Politics on the Horizon 2020 project, Protect, the Right to International Protection, a pendulum between globalization and nativization. So this is an EC-funded collaborative research project conducted by a consortium of 11 partner universities in Europe, Canada, and South Africa. As a postdoctoral researcher, she's involved in Work Package 4, which investigates vulnerability and the lived experiences of refugees who are immobilized in the Greek refugee camps, notably on Lesbos Island and Thessaloniki in North Greece. So Evgenia studied sociology and social anthropology in Greece with a focus on gender and completed her PhD in social policy and criminology at the Open University in the UK, on the 2015 refugee crisis and border violence. But in addition to her academic credentials, she has also worked for more than a decade in detention centres and refugee camps on Lesbos and the Greek mainland as an NGO practitioner, and she therefore has extensive professional experience with survivors of torture, sexual violence and human trafficking. So Evgenia, take it away, and I'll give you the 5-minute and 2-minute warnings. Thank you very much.
All right. So, hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to attend and present here today. It's an honor to be actually here and presenting in this important conference on the lived experiences of detention and border controls. My name is Evgenia, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Politics at the University of Surrey. And today I'm going to speak about the politics of detention of irregularized migrants in Greece. 1 minute here. So my research is a self-reflexive ethnographic research in Greece and Lesbos Island, and it explores the EU responses towards the refugee crisis and the long-term ongoing human consequences of these responses upon forcibly displaced people. And since 2005, I have worked as an NGO practitioner in refugee camps and detention centers by providing social support to forcibly displaced persons. I worked in many different sites of confinement in border zones in the Greek mainland and the islands, and I was also actively involved for many years in grassroots movements supporting refugees who were reaching Lesbos. These experiences were often shocking, traumatic, and life-changing, as over time and through my different positionalities, I witnessed the continuum of institutional and structural violence, the result of and violation of human dignity, the pain and suffering and deaths of people seeking international protection in the hands of the Greek authorities, and more broadly by the proliferating thanatopolitical border regime. So, in the aftermath of the 2015 refugee crisis, Greece attracted much attention due to the escalation of border violence and the infliction of harm against forcibly displaced people. Despite the new and increased attention on and documentation of border violence at sea and open refugee camps, there is a relatively limited focus on the continuum of the implicit and routinized forms of violence against migrants inside police stations, pre-removal centers, and other detention facilities across Greece. I say continuum of violence and border controls across time and space because despite the recent attention on Greece, Greece, the region, has a long migration and refugee history. In the 1990s, Greece became an important entry point into Europe for irregularized migrants from Albania. While between 2000 and 2014, Greece, the Aegean Islands, and Lesbos in particular became the main entry points for irregularized migrants from Asian and African countries trying to reach Northern European states. The sites that were used to host irregularized migrants were initially monasteries and churches, police stations, former prisons and military bases, or former warehouses and public buildings. And there are several reports from international and non-governmental organizations, journalists and other professionals, academics, researchers, which were documenting this inadequate laws governing the asylum procedures, the unsuitable reception and degrading living conditions irregularized migrants were experiencing on entering the Greek territory. Therefore, the focus of this presentation is to highlight exactly the violence continuum, that is, the implicit and routinized forms of institutional and structural violence and border controls against migrants, which continue, persist, proliferate inside police stations, pre-removal centers, and other detention facilities across Greece. As an NGO, as a female NGO practitioner, activist, and researcher for many years in border zones in Greece, working in and researching sites of confinement has been very challenging. This is firstly because of the restricted access that professionals such as NGO practitioners, researchers and academics and activists have to these sites. The restricted access in these sites of confinement are heavily securitized, monitored and controlled by the police. And in order for practitioners and activists to gain access to these sites, their access is approved or prohibited by the headquarters of the police. Therefore, there is a strong gatekeeping and control, which makes the access to these places almost impossible. Secondly, the restricted access is because frequently these sites are geographically remote, isolated spaces and hidden from view. This fact makes it really hard for practitioners and activists to locate them and reach them, and researchers to study them. They are in between places and consist of thresholds of liminality. For example, the Pagani Detention Center where I worked between 2008 and 2010 was located 4 kilometers outside the city of Mytilene, the capital of Lesbos, in an industrial zone. The detention center was surrounded by abandoned allotments and in a sense was hidden away behind warehouses and wholesale businesses. If one was not aware about its existence and exact location, it would be very difficult to find. And this is not surprising, as most of these sites in Greece are inaccessible closed facilities, usually out of sight and out of mind. This sense of remoteness is even more striking at the Greek-Turkish land borders in the Evros region. I have traveled several times to Evros and I had access to police departments and detention centers such as Phylakio, Feres and Tihero. And in one of my first trips there, I remember driving for hours in order to reach these facilities, which were literally in the middle of nowhere. I remember the initial panic I felt when I realized how easily and silently one could become intercepted, pushed back, and even forcibly disappeared without leaving any traces. There were already several reports documenting enforced disappearances at the Greek-Turkish land borders, but after 2015, these reports have significantly proliferated. However, this sense of remoteness was and still is prevalent in detention facilities and police departments, which can also be located within society's social fabric. For instance, on Lesbos Island, there are multiple police departments where refugees are detained, but these sites are frequently inaccessible to citizens, NGOs, activist networks, researchers, while even lawyers have frequently limited access. Similarly, in Athens, the pre-removal detention center in Petrourali is also difficult to access, despite the proximity of the facility to the city center, and is heavily monitored and controlled by the police. Likewise, the pre-removal detention center in Amygdaleza is an infamous remote facility located in Attica, which is also heavily controlled by the police. Working in and researching prisons, detentions, and other sites of confinement is also very challenging because these places are sites of extreme violence, wherein harm and violence is endemic. In these sites, refugees are routinely detained for prolonged periods of time, sometimes more than 18 months, in appalling, inhuman and degrading conditions, in basements without having access to outdoor space, physical light and fresh air, to adequate hygienic and sanitary conditions, clean clothes and mattresses, and with no communication with the outside world. They have limited access to information to asylum procedures, limited access to legal aid and social and psychological support. In such degrading conditions, refugees were and still experiencing the violation of their human dignity. More broadly, in the whole country, there were and still are various police department detention facilities where the aforementioned conditions are replicated as a pattern. In Evros, I was shocked when during one of my visits in the facility in Ferris, I witnessed refugees being detained in a quite small warehouse-type facility within the police department, and due to the overcrowded facilities, they were forced to sleep outside in the yard. Similarly, in Lesbos, as in other sites, what was very striking was the routinization of prolonged detention, even of the unaccompanied minors, who under the protective custody of the state could spend months in structurally violent conditions, exposed to multiple forms of violence. Also inside the hotspot of Moria, there was a detention facility known as Section B, wherein the deportable nationalities were detained. In Section B, detainees had restricted access to international protection, limited legal aid and social care, and restricted access to information about the asylum procedures. What is even more striking is that for many NGOs, deportable refugees were not the target group of their humanitarian intervention, and therefore they were not of interest. Finally, police department facilities and other sites of confinement in Greece have for far too long been sites of infliction of temporal and therefore of state violence, where refugees are detained for uncertain periods of time without knowing why and what they are waiting for. Also, contrary to other prisoners in jails, detainee refugees in these facilities do not have the luxury of a sentence. As a result, their waiting becomes enduring, and their spatial confinement automatically also becomes a temporal one. Finally, working in and researching prisons, detentions, police department facilities is very challenging because as sites of extreme violence, anyone who traverses their threshold easily becomes vulnerable to state brutality. During my work as an NGO practitioner in Pantani Detention Center, I was overexposed to violence and intimidation. This violence and intimidation by the Greek authorities included rape threats and sexual harassment. I was frequently threatened by state officials that they are going to lock me inside male detainees' rooms, cells, where consequently I would be raped, as irregular arrived migrants were systematically perceived and demonized by the authorities as criminals and rapists. During that period, in each cell, there were detained approximately 300 male detainees. Other forms of violence I was exposed to were verbal and psychological violence through screams and shouting, symbolic violence through humiliation and devaluation, and everyday practices of intimidation beyond the institutional walls of the detention. I was frequently watched, stalked, and harassed, accused of smuggling or espionage, and photographed by the police without my consent in public spaces of Lesbos. The intimidation continued also during my research on Lesbos, when during the interviews which I conducted with Frontex staff, I was photographed without my consent, while during one of these interviews, 2 Greek policemen entered the room, took a seat, and watched the whole interview process. Therefore, working in science and research in prisons is quite challenging, as harm is omnipresent both for the detainees and the practitioners who challenge these powerful and harmful structures. To this, one must add the psychological and mental impact which research in these violent contexts can have. Firstly, upon people who are fleeing violence, torture, human rights abuses, and cope with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. I have witnessed myself many detainees harming themselves by hitting their heads against the iron bars and the walls until they bleed, or by cutting themselves due to the anxiety and despair. Oof, sorry, it's a little bit difficult. And secondly, to researchers' mental health through the post-traumatic stress disorder also. Yes, and of course the burnout and the vicarious traumatization which follows. So to conclude, the continuum of violence and brutality in detention centers, police departments and pre-removal centers in European countries such as Greece against forcibly displaced people is beyond imagination. So due to the various challenges and difficulties described in this presentation, these sites remain to an extent under-researched despite the attention that Greece has attracted after the 2015 refugee crisis. As a result, these places in nowhere routinely and continuously operate as black holes, and the need for more thorough and holistic research is urgent, more than ever. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Evgenia. So we now move on to our third speaker of this morning's panel, Dr. Martina Tazzioli from Goldsmith University of London. So Martina is a lecturer in politics and technology at Goldsmiths. She's the author of The Making of Migration, the Biopolitics of Mobility at Europe's Borders, Spaces of Governmentality, Autonomous Migration and the Arab Uprisings, and co-author of Tunisia as a Revolutionized Space of Migration. She's also the co-editor of Foucault and the History of Our Present and Foucault and the Making of Subjects. She is also on the editorial board of the journal Radical Philosophy. Dr. Tazzioli, without any further ado, on you go.
Thank you, Dominic. Just let me share this. Okay, so good morning, everyone. What I present today is part of my research on what I consider like a focus on mobility as a political technology of governmentality. So how migrants.
Martina, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just your screen is showing. It's not showing your slides.
No.
It's just that's it.
It's not showing. Sorry.
Yeah. Now it's showing the slides. That's fine.
But if sorry, 1 second. If I do like this, you don't see my slides. You see my script. That
looks like your notes or your speech. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so maybe I should. I don't know why, because it shouldn't happen. Well, I can also do without. No worry. Without the slide are not that important. Anyway, so. What I'm interested in discussing today is the use of displacement, how displacement has become a key political technology of migration governmentality to regain control over what I call unruly mobility, to harm migrants and violently obstruct migrants from accessing rights, safe space, and asylum. So, and as I said, as I just mentioned, this is part of my research about the use of mobility, how states, and also with the support of some non-state actors, use mobility as a political technology to debilitate and to regain control over migration. So how mobility is not only what is governed by the states, but also what is used for governing and controlling migration by keeping them on the move and by exhausting migrants at the internal frontiers of Europe. And what I want to suggest today, so having in mind the framework of this panel, is to to consider two key political technologies used by states in Europe at the moment, that is pushback and dispersal, as part of displacement. So dispersal and pushback, I suggest, can be included under the umbrella of displacement and of this governing migration through displacement. So of course, these imply revisiting the very notion of displacement. First, in refugee studies, displacement is conceived as, I quote, a coerced movement of a person or people away from their home or home region. And of course, and so these, if we include dispersal and pushback in displacement, is of course necessary to widen displacement beyond the dispossession from home or home region, and to understand displacement rather as a spatial tactic used by states to police and arm migrants on the move. Second, the notion of displacement is usually associated with forced migration and with its causes, in particular with conflict-induced displacement, development-induced displacement, and disaster-induced displacement. So unlike fixing, confining, or detaining migrants, governing through displacement involves arming and chasing them away without, however, transferring them to any specific space. So there is this removal, right, from safe space of migrants who are en route. So of course, there are multiple ways in which displacement is enacted, but I'm particularly interested in drawing attention to how displacement is nowadays systematically enacted by state at the internal frontiers of Europe against migrants who are on movement, against people on the move. So recently, the editors of the new Handbook of Displacement call for the need of including, I quote, in defining displacement, other spatial scales of analysis beyond national boundaries and live experiences, so that internal displacement and their everyday recurrences are not overlooked. So along similar line, I suggest to conceptualize displacement as a political technology for managing migration by temporarily removing them, even when, of course, state actors know that migrants will come back. In particular, this is the case with dispersal, so that this deterrence tactic is not necessarily useful per se, right? So, and of course, this is not a new tactic, but what is important to observe, in my opinion, is the systematic use of both pushback and dispersal as political technologies for regaining control over this unruly mobility, and also how these spatial tactics that are not fully let's say regulated by the law, right? How they have been increasingly incorporated in the daily practices of border control. So why in particular is useful to include both pushback and dispersal under the category of displacement? First, I suggest because of the opacity and unaccountability of this heterogeneous form of displacement. So how to account for states-induced displacement, including unmonitoring pushback operation and also eviction in urban spaces. So in particular, when migrants are dispersed from makeshift camps. So, and this question of opacity is at the core also of activist practices that try to deal and to fight against pushback and dispersal. And the second point is the question of temporality. So, what happens after these heterogeneous forms of displacement? What happens after being removed without being relocated? So this question of temporality, this is always like overshadowed or under theorized in the literature. What happens after these informal and modes of displacement, in the sense that they often take place at the very edge of the law, and that constantly, so when states constantly blur the very boundaries between what is allowed by the law and what is illegal, right? And third point is important, as I said, to highlight the systematic use of this violent spatial tactics which consist in chasing, removing people without relocating them. So I want to focus in particular on dispersal, but I also briefly mention something about pushback, because of course it's gaining like a lot of attention at the moment. And of course, pushback, as I already said, is definitely not a new border control tactic. But what is important to notice is how pushback operations are increasingly used also along the land borders. So in May 2021, civil society organizations from 6 countries published a report, Pushing Back Responsibility, Rights Violation as a Welcome Treatment at Europe's Borders, in which they collect evidence and testimonies of pushback that took place along the Balkan route, as well as at the French-Italian borders. They have reported evidence of 2,162 cases of pushbacks. Among these, they gather evidence of 176 chain pushbacks, how they call them, meaning by that, I quote from the report, forced expulsions across multiple borders where migrants or refugees are, via an informal cooperation between different states, sent from one state, for instance, Austria or Italy, through others, including Slovenia and Croatia, to a third country such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, without having been there in the first place. So pushback can be included, if we look through the lenses of also what this report says, as part of political technology for governing mobility in a violent way through mobility, that is by keeping migrants on the move. And this systematic use of pushback, of course, we can observe a continuity of what is going on along the Balkan routes with what is going on in the Mediterranean Sea, and also considering how states try to prevent any accusation of pushback through like specific strategy, as is well known through the Memorandum of Understanding with Libya. Italy prevents the accusation of pushback and asking the Libyan, right, to capture migrants at sea and to push them back, what has been also defined by NGOs as tactic of pullback, right? So, and what is interesting about pushback for me, apart from these like list, right, of this collection of this list of pushback, is not only the attempt to come to grips with the opacity of the pushback and the fact that even organizations are totally aware of the opacity, of the impossibility of counting all of them, so that the numbers that they provide are not accurate, because of course pushback are much more than the pushback that they manage to monitor. But what I would like to discuss is, what if we take pushback, and as I will tell in a minute, also dispersal, as a lens for rethinking border controls, as a lens for shedding light on specific modes of violence, through precisely this ambivalence, legal ambiguity and opacity. So moving on to dispersal, when I say dispersal, well, I refer to how migrants are governed by keeping them on the move, but also in particular how they are governed by being chased away by the police, and being violently evicted from a makeshift camp in order to avoid points of fixation, how French authorities call it. And this is, well, I had a couple of pictures, but are not particularly relevant, about how dispersal is enacted in key border zones such as Calais and Ventimiglia, where migrants are constantly harassed by the police. And this tactic of dispersal is, well, there is a continuity, but is also partly different from how dispersal is officially enforced in the UK. The dispersal, the so-called dispersal strategies used for governing asylum seekers, and that was enforced in 1999. So this more institutionalized way of governing asylum seekers by moving them from big urban center to so-called dispersal area in order to avoid big concentration. Here, I'm more interested in, even if, as I said, there is a continuity, in dispersal strategies that are not officially are not like part of any law, right? And that however police enact on a daily basis in different countries, and in particular in my research I focus on France and Italy, but these are definitely not the only places where this happens. So what is interesting about dispersal is the inaccuracy of numbers, right? Methodologically is particularly different to account for dispersal. And however, even if migrant dispersal is difficult to map, state authorities regulate, count, and manage dispersal. So in this regard, I want to take into account a specific case. So the dispersal happening in the city of Paris, where migrants are systematically evicted from makeshift camp in a violent way. So in 2018, the French NGO SAMU Social published a report who are the migrants who have been sheltered, in which they list the statistics and number about the migrants that upon eviction have been relocated into accommodation center in France between June 2015 and November 2016. So what emerges is that the politics of dispersal in Paris is strictly connected with the operation of what French authorities call mise à l'abri, so sheltering migrants in multiple ways. First, the number of eviction is cross-checked with the number of migrants relocated into hosting center, since in principle, all migrants who are evicted from a makeshift camp are channeled into the accommodation system, even if in practice this is not true. Second, after being transferred to an accommodation center, migrants are registered on the basis of the evicted makeshift camp they come from. So it's very interesting. They are registered through a reference by mentioning the makeshift camp from which they have been evicted. So there is this institutional connection made at the level of how migrants are identified once they are relocated. However, far from being accurate numbers, the effect of dispersal is counted in a quite rough way, also to the discrepancy between those people who are evicted and those who are actually transferred, also because migrants try to escape, right? Because they know that being relocated in these shelters means also being identified. Interestingly, I think this is very a relevant point. The number of migrants evicted is the result of the statistic of the Prefecture of Paris and of the organization Emmaus. Indeed, Emmaus is in charge of counting migrants in makeshift camps, and mobile teams go and check in every makeshift camp how many people live per town and makes an estimation of the total population of the camp. The data is shared with local authorities and cross-checked with the data collected by the prefecture. Indeed, before starting an eviction operation, personnel from the prefecture goes to the camp and conducts a rough head counts of the people who live there. So there is this attempt to count roughly how many people live there, and this is done, is important in cooperation between the authorities and humanitarian actors. So to conclude, I'm aware of time, by rethinking displacement as a political technology enforced by states, also in collaboration with some non-state actors to govern unruly movements, forced migration and displacement are not necessarily conflated. So we can rethink displacement beyond how it has been conceptualized in refugee studies. Displacement through pushback and through dispersal and eviction enacted against migrants en route ends up in violently obstructing migrants' mobility as well as access to asylum. Even if it can be defined as a spatial tactic of governmentality, displacement has also consequences on the temporality of migration by decelerating movement, blocking migrants in border zone for weeks or months, and forcing them to undertake more convoluted road. And in the end, as the anthropologist Sharam Khoshravi defined it, stealing their time. So in light of this multiple geography of displacement, the political and theoretical stake, in my opinion, is how to come to grips with this unaccountability, right, invisibility of displacement, but also with the border violence that is not perceived as such, right, that tend to be under-theorized precisely because sometimes doesn't end up in blatant act of violence. And I would like to conclude by asking how, in your opinion, if we take dispersal and pushback as lens, analytical lens, how we can conceptualize, how we end up in conceptualize border violence differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martina. So the questions are coming in thick and fast in the chat, so please feel free to continue sending them through. After our final speaker, then we'll move to the Q&A session. So our final speaker is Dr. Sana Murrani. Dr. Murrani is an associate professor in spatial practice at the University of Plymouth in the UK, with a background in architecture and urban design. Her main research highlights the impact of transient conditions of war, conflict, and displacement on people's creative spatial responses to sudden changes in their built environment. So Dr. Murrani uses participatory action research, experience-based co-design approaches, and creative mapping techniques that rely on spatial thinking, memory mapping, and speculative and imaginative drawing and layering. So she is the founder of the Displacement Studies Research Network and co-founder of the Justice and Imagination in Global Displacement Research Collective, working at the intersection between displacement, design, imagination, and justice. And they do this in order to research, share, and enhance the impact and power of creative agencies of displaced peoples, their identity, memory, and the spaces and places they create and inhabit. Dr. Murrani, the floor is yours, and then after Dr. Murrani, we will move to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here taking part in this, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to talk to you about is two research projects. One of them is finished and one of them is still nearly at the end. So the first one is based in the UK, and it's looking at displacement after detention centres. So this is the multiple dispersal that happens internally in the UK to a group of refugees, which was done in the southwest. I don't know why my slides keep running slightly ahead of me. The other one is another project which is looking at the movement of people and tracking the displacement through material culture. And this is looking at 3 different countries, UK, Greece, and Sweden. So
Sana, sorry, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can't see the slides. I'm not sure if you're sharing the screen.
All right.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. I think I shared them to begin with, and then I stopped it because it was not working properly. Here we go.
They've got a mind of their own sometimes.
Yes.
That's come up now. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Here we are. So I might have to switch back, but I'll see how it works. So I would like to show you this. So this is a displacement at a glance. These are just pulled from the UNHCR. That circle on the left corner, I've been using the slide with my students for the last, I don't know, 7 years, and every single year I move it by at least a couple of million, which is absolutely staggering. What this slide is really showing is that the number of people who are coming into the, let's say, global north of the world are minute compared to the number of people who are either internally displaced or people who are displaced close border countries to their home countries. And in the UK, we only get 1% of this in the form of asylum seekers. And out of that, I would like you to just focus at the number of the very small number of people seeking asylum in the UK. And this is as of 2019. And I heard just now from Professor Bosworth that this number is even less now than it was then in 2019. So you all know asylum in the UK leaves people waiting for months and sometimes for years. But what I would like to really focus on is how this hostile environment continues to become a problem as people leave detention centres and get dispersed into cities. The mental trauma of displacement continues as people grapple with migration systems, search for decent accommodation, but also housing. And this narrative of trauma intensifies as they also remember and grieve for the loss of their loved ones, their homes and homelands. The support of refugees in the recovery from trauma is too generic to be effective in this country or elsewhere. And the fact is, the picture across Europe is not that different to the UK. So creative methods of engagement with social research on migration have been on the rise recently. And it's acknowledging the power of the visual, participatory, co-designed kind of collaborative approach to research with migrants and refugees. And for that to have a significant and impactful into their health and well-being, and also contributes to their social integration, which is another big issue that we have. Caroline Lynette, who's worked on a number of research projects in Australia with refugees, makes a very strong case for the capacity of creative and participatory research methods to generate sanctuary in refugee research. She locates knowledge holders as people who, with lived experiences of forced migration, to be at the center of research with refugees. Obviously, with this comes the possibility of slipping into fixed narratives and labels of refugees. And this is why there is a need to focus on the destruction and reconstruction of narratives and imaginaries raised around this topic. So here I will introduce to you a project which was funded by the European Cultural Foundation in partnership with the British Red Cross. We worked with a group of asylum seekers. Then some of them over the course of the project gained their refugee status. But the project was initially a pilot project run between September 2018 and October 2019. The question, how can refugees make new homes which draw upon their cultural and material as well as spatial and social environments from which they have been displaced. So this is recovering and reinventing their heritage in a very different context. The narrative of the trauma of war and conflict, displacement, border crossing, detention, dispersal, and integration represented common themes for our group of 12 participants. And as you saw here in this picture, we intentionally wanted to show them, they wanted to show their faces, because they were, because we were working as co-producers of the research. They were really wanting to say, look, we want to show people who we are. We're not victims. We're just like anyone else, but also we are human, just like everyone else in this. And we want to have that capacity of being able to present what we're proud of. So the showing of the face was intentional, but we also wanted it to be led by them. So they said what they wanted to wear, how they wanted to pose. All of that was part of the visual kind of representation of the work. Between them, they originated from 4 continents, 10 countries, and spoke 6 languages. What united them was emotional loss and longing for home. For ethical reasons, we deliberately did not speak of loss for the entire duration of the project. While this was another shared theme, our focus was on countering the trauma of loss through positive memories of home and homeland. The academic team was deliberately left small. There was me as the architect and the map maker, and a psychologist with expertise in mental health and trauma, and we had 2 research assistants working with us. We designed a participatory action research a project by adopting an approach which is known as experience-based co-design, so EBCD, which is an emerging method that has been successfully used to develop and improve health services. Our project psychologist has been championing this method of research with a group of researchers in Sweden. This approach we took, basically we designed the project within that, but we really wanted to follow another kind of element of that, where it's a slow, iterative, cyclically kind of reflective type process orientated around participants' lived experiences, which we used as touch points, emotional touch points. These emotional touch points, which are critical topics from each participant's perspectives were loosely revolving around the concept of home, which is the main topic of the research that we had. These touch points evoked feelings of happiness or sadness in the teller, but they also kind of emphasized this main issue around the subject of narrative. Most importantly, they addressed issues around testimonial injustices, and which happen as the speaker is denied a voice, or by being unheard or invalidated during interactions with others. We also used multimodal storytelling techniques to create opportunities and routes to address testimonial injustices by utilizing these testimonies as touch points. Our touch points, in that the use of them extended to the conceptualization of home as sites of memory in response to displacement. We introduced experimental deep mapping techniques ranging from geographical tracing of journeys of daily routes taken in home countries to memories of childhood through photographs that they brought with them, narratives and stories that they told, as well as objects that they managed to bring across. These resultant cognitive maps, also known as counter maps, are a set of embodied representations of temporality and states of precariousness charted cognitively through spaces of mobility by people fleeing home. Often they stand in opposition of the politics of bordering and ordering, coordinated by a state. We worked with different scales, which was another intentional issue that we had to kind of grapple with, from the personally minute to the broadly national, all of which permeate these understandings and mappings of home. It is important here to point out the series of ruptures as causing both migratory displacement and detours in movement and obstructed mobilities in people's journeys into safety. These were reflected in the fragmentary maps. Identifying rupture emphasizes the multiple stopping points and homes in the migratory journeys. There is this other issue that we wanted to engage with, which is which I've just mentioned, the issue of detours. And I would like to mention a quote here whereby Krishna Ratnam and Danielle Rodowski engaging with the meaning of detours as ruptures in the mobility of forcibly displaced refugees, where they say, and I quote, "In the new mobilities paradigm, places are intertwined processes, experiences, and networks constructed over the life course and carried to new homes and places of resettlement. Different memories, experiences, and identities amass and are carried to rupture points become parts of the life course," end quote. What's interesting to note is that this creative experience-based participatory co-design approach can be easily replicated as a method that crosses and caters for multiple disciplines working together. Here is a project that I have been working on as a research consultant, which is called Made in Migration, led by Dr. Rachel Kiddy from Oxford University. She's a contemporary material archaeologist. And we've been working in a collaborative collective with a group of refugees and migrants who have traveled across from the Middle East in particular, but also further afield to Greece and Sweden, as well as UK. Made in Migration uses material objects of displacement as touch points, and the issues we discuss capitalize on the ruptures and the detours. Those ruptures and detours come in different ways, shapes, and forms. Some of them are material ruptures, for example, geography and objects, and others are immaterial, such as policy legislations of detention and inhumane camps, especially in Greece. This is in addition to asylum rights, and visa applications, which we've taken with a poet who worked with us to basically decipher, because we had to work with a lot of those applications with the group. For those of you who can't read this bit of the slide in Arabic, this is a drawing done in one of the camps in Greece, where it says UNHCR, the United Nations Commission for the Imprisonment of Refugees in Greece. The project is now online, showing all the data collected and made with the large team of refugees and asylum seekers across the 3 countries. In conclusion, I just wanted to kind of mention how we find here, through the success of the 2 projects, that really what is incredibly important is the focus on people's lived experiences and in the nature of the creative co-design approach to that, as well as the interdisciplinary aspect of that research. So across the 2 projects, we had a group that is made out of activists, archaeologists, architects, poets, filmmakers, lawyers, and psychologists, who are all researchers, as well as a group of refugees and asylum seekers who also have experiences in business management, in filmmaking, in poetry writing, and so on and so forth. So this humane approach into the take of the project leaves us with an understanding of how trauma can be slightly ameliorated of displacement, as we see the group of refugees develop into an outstanding members of the community, as we can see here in this last slide, where I would like to leave you with this quote done by a participant of Creative Recovery, who has done amazing work so far. He's been an activist in the Southwest, and now he's moved into Scotland, and he's been doing really well. But part of the kind of the work that we're doing is also to look at what happens afterwards. So we don't leave them, we stay with them, even though the projects do end. We do end having an extended type of engagement with the researchers, and we incorporate them into our future research, which we have done in the past. And so it's with this. I'm not going to read the quote, I'm going to leave you with that, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and thank you very much to all of our speakers.